Hello viewers, and welcome to a very special video production. My name is Mitch, also known as the 10th Nazgul, and joining me as almost always is Matthew.
Greetings, everyone.
Today we're going to be trying something a little bit different. We're going to be covering the latest preview article from Fantasy Flight Games about the second adventure pack in the upcoming Ringmaker cycle of adventure packs. The name of this article, and the name of the adventure pack itself, is the 3 Trials. This adventure pack is going to be taking place immediately after the events of the Dunland Trap, and if you happen to check out that other article, Caleb Grace doesn't really want to disclose anything about that story, apart from mentioning that you're going to have to deal with wave after wave of ferocious Dunlending adversaries. So in the Voice of Isengard Deluxe expansion, we'll have to venture into Fangorn Forest, we'll have to capture an orc leader, and we'll have to fight off the vicious enemies from Dunland, the Dunlendings. And we'll be apparently dealing with those once again in the Dunland Trap, but we're going to be doing something quite different in the 3 Trials. So this article starts by saying, after their efforts to help Saruman discover the means to forestall the forces of Mordor leads them deep into the heart of Dunland, several of Middle-earth's greatest heroes must undertake a series of 3 deadly trials. In the 3 Trials, Middle-earth's heroes must defeat 3 ferocious Dunlending guardian spirits, claim their keys, and recover an ancient Dunlending artifact, the Antlered Crown. The new scenario from the 3 Trials places immediate pressure upon your heroes and their efforts. Like Raven's Guardian, one of our new enemies, each of the scenario's 3 guardians shares the Time X keyword, forcing you to move swiftly along your quest or suffer the consequences of failure. So for those of you that missed it, Time X is a new keyword that represents the urgency of the hero's quest. When a card with the Time X keyword is revealed, the players put X resource tokens on that card. These tokens are called time counters, and at the end of each refresh phase, remove 1 time counter from each card with the Time X keyword if able. When the last time counter is removed, there will be a triggered effect that resolves on that card. Some encounter cards will also remove time counters, making it more difficult for the players to predict when they will run out of time. So Matthew, why don't you introduce the first of our new adversaries?
So Raven's Guardian has an engagement cost of 50, 3 threat, 3 attack strength, 5 defense strength, and a whopping 8 hit points. He's unique, he's a guardian, and he has the Raven trait. He cannot have non-key attachments. He has the time 4 keyword and forced. After the last time counter is removed from Raven's Guardian, deal 1 damage to each character controlled by the engaged player. Place 4 time counters on Raven's Guardian. He's also worth 3 victory points. So first off, I will say that his art is very, very cool. I don't know a ton about Middle-earth lore, certainly not as much of Master of Lore or Derek from our Grey Company podcast. Maybe they can fill me in on the Ravens, or maybe they're an FFG creation. I really don't know, but I will say I think the card art is really cool. The time mechanic here is interesting, and it sort of refills itself. I can't help but wonder if there are going to be encounter cards that remove time tokens. I feel like in one of the previous articles, they mentioned that some of the treacheries will either add or most likely take away time tokens, so it might not actually just be 4 rounds. You might get punished and have this force effect trigger more quickly, but it certainly seems like a very interesting sort of boss enemy for this quest.
I'll definitely be curious to see what exactly these key attachments end up being, just because the article mentions that we're going to be claiming these keys, especially if there are multiple guardians in play at the same time. I think that time keyword, even though it gives you 4 rounds to deal with this guy, could be extremely nasty. That 5 defense is awfully hard to try and surmount. Even if you've got multiple Rivendell blades working in your favor, it just seems like a really, really nasty adversary here. So he's not hitting particularly hard, but that is just an absolutely brutal forced effect, and depending on what he comes attached with him, if that were to boost up his attack strength or give him extra attacks, that could just end up being really nasty. And of course, I'm curious to see our other Guardians.
Yeah, my speculation here is that because it's the 3 trials, you have to have a key to move on to the next trial. But yeah, that's interesting. They certainly could, perhaps in some way, boost up these Guardians. So yeah, I'm very curious to see those as well.
If I had to guess, I'd say you probably hit the nail on the head thinking that you have to complete 1 trial before you can move on to the next. Maybe these keys are even going to end up providing some sort of benefit before we actually obtain this antlered crown. Who knows if in AP number 3 we're actually going to be getting the antlered crown as an objective. Again, as somebody not terribly well versed in the lore, if somebody happens to know what exactly the antlered crown is, if it's something mentioned in the appendices, be sure to fill in Matthew and I. But continuing along on the article, it goes on to say that the scenario's guardians and other threats will offer your heroes no chance to catch their breath, so you'll want to come prepared to fight your way to your goal through round after round of high-intensity combats, which makes this sound like the Dunland Trap, which is supposed to be just ferocious, unending, vicious combat. So, in addition to challenging you to power your way quickly through its powerful enemies, the 3 trials permits a wide range of strategic considerations and possible quest combinations, making it an immensely replayable scenario. And this phrase makes me think of the Steward's Fear, where each time you play through the 3 trials, you have to go up against a different series of guardians with their key attachments, so maybe it's a little bit different each and every time you play. So, before we get to our player cards, the article goes on to say finally, the 3 trials introduces a new spirit hero, as well as 3 copies of each player card. Fans of Middle-earth's elves will be pleased to find 2 new elven allies, 1 Noldor and 1 Sylvan, as well as events and attachments that promote the cycle's new Sylvan sub-themes, just like we saw in the Dunland Trap. You'll also find a handful of cards that further support the game's secrecy keyword, and decks that can keep their threat at 20 or lower.
So we have 2 player cards spoiled in this article. The first is a lore event, Noiseless Movement, which costs 1. Its action reads, choose an enemy in the staging area. That enemy does not make engagement checks this round. Then, if your threat is 20 or less, and this is the first time you played a copy of Noiseless Movement this round, return this card to your hand instead of discarding it. So this card doesn't mention Secrecy by name, but certainly it is a Secrecy card, though I suppose you could play it in any deck. So it's a way for lore players to avoid engaging with an enemy, or perhaps in a multiplayer game, everyone from having to engage with an enemy. So in that sense, it's sort of like Fresh Tracks. But again, with the added benefit of if you meet that secrecy threshold of 20 or less, it comes back to your hand. Perhaps you could play it again on a second enemy. So certainly some interesting potential here. What do you think about it, Mitch?
I was kind of floored when I looked at this card. I think especially in a solo environment, particularly if you're playing Secrecy, I think this could be immensely powerful, considering that players are normally just flipping 1 card off the encounter deck if there's some sort of enemy that comes off the encounter deck. If you can keep that sitting there in the staging area, if you can take advantage of effects like Dune here or Great U-Bow, maybe even 4th Air Aerolingus, turn after turn, you can keep chipping away or outright killing these enemies as they're coming off the encounter deck. So maybe wimpy enemies come to you, you can defend and then kill them, and then anything with some sort of nasty when engages effect or anything like that, you can just pin down indefinitely in the staging area. So I definitely think there are going to be cards with that timed keyword where it's going to kind of work against this strategy, but honestly, this card just seems incredibly powerful. It just seems like you could lock down one enemy turn after turn after turn. I think another really powerful use for this card is in a deck with a ton of willpower. Sometimes it can be so much easier to quest through an enemy as opposed to killing it completely. Like if there's some high defense, high hit points, a low threat value enemy, if you can pin it in the staging area for maybe one additional round, or if you can ideally recycle this event and lock it in there indefinitely, it just seems like you can make some horrifying enemy absolutely no big deal at all. So I love that you don't have to have that secrecy threshold to use this card. There's certainly nothing preventing players from running multiple copies. It's cheap. It's easy to put out. It just seems like in some decks this could be an absolute game changer.
I think that this card could potentially combo very nicely with the second player card that was spoiled in this article, which is the Leaf Brooch, a 1-cost attachment, which is an item attached to a hero, limit 1 per hero. The first event card you play each round that matches the attached hero's printed sphere gains Secrecy 1. So, again, certainly Noiseless movement could be played for free. If you happen to have this on a hero, you play it, you lock down one enemy. If your Secrecy threshold, it bounces back to your hand. You can play it again for free to potentially lock down 2 enemies, and then Noiseless movement would be discarded. So my first thought upon reading this article, in the previous article, knowing that Secrecy would be another sub-theme of this cycle, but then seeing some actual Secrecy cards, my thought was, are Leaf Brooch and Noiseless movement enough to resurrect those Secrecy cards from the Dwarrowdelf cycle? So Mitch, as you very well know in our discussions, I was not a huge fan of Secrecy. I don't think a lot of players are, though certainly there are Secrecy fans out there. But most people don't dislike Secrecy as a mechanic in and of itself. They dislike it because are the Secrecy cards we have thus far enough to sort of really try and keep your threat that low, either hampering yourself with only 1 or 2 heroes, or really hoping you draw some of those threat lowering events. So again, my thought here is, are the Leaf Brooch and Noiseless movement enough to resurrect Secrecy? I'm sure we'll get more in this cycle. For me, the verdict is still out, but I think that these are a step in the right direction for resurrecting this sort of underutilized keyword.
That's definitely going to be interesting to see. I certainly was not impressed with Secrecy when it originally came out. It seemed like Secrecy, in theory, always should have been something where the cards by themselves are relatively powerful, or at least on par with other cards, and if you punish yourself by keeping your threat value low, if you deprive yourself of one of your 3 starting heroes, if you manage to keep your threat value very low through any number of effects, it seems like Secrecy should have been some additional benefit that really rewarded the players, and that's just not what we saw with those player cards. In the Voice of Isengard, of course, we start to see some extraordinarily powerful cards with the Doomed keyword. Cards like Legacy of Numenor that allow you to add a resource to every hero in play at the cost of Doomed 3, and Deep Knowledge, which allows every player to draw 2 cards at the cost of Doomed 2. Those are such powerful effects, particularly in the early game, and I'm going to be really curious to see if Caleb and Matt manage to design Secrecy to be powerful enough that it can present a viable alternative to that kind of deck archetype, just because it seems like they're so wildly incompatible.
Yeah, if I was the betting type, and I used to live in Las Vegas, so I am, I would bet that the Doomed keyword and Doomed decks will probably come out on top of Secrecy decks, but that's just me sitting here having seen just the deluxe expansion and 2 preview articles for the AP. So who knows if I'll be singing a different tune by our 6th AP months and months and months down the road, but I'm wagering that Doomed is going to end up being a much more powerful mechanic.
I think I'm going to tentatively have to agree with you there. It certainly seems like it fits in well with our existing player cards, but I've got to say Noiseless Movement has me really excited about running some sort of Dune here type deck. Something that has me particularly excited for effects like Leaf Brooch here is that this is cumulative, so even though it's limit 1 per hero, if you manage to get sufficient card advantage working in your favor, maybe if you're running something like a lore deck, taking advantage of that noiseless movement, you can see a huge reduction in cost, because that secrecy value, gaining secrecy 1, stacks with existing secrecy costs. So the article goes on to mention that if you play something like the Galadrim's Greeting, if you've got 3 spirit heroes in play and they each have an attached leaf brooch, you're going to be able to play that 3 cost event for absolutely free. And even though this neutral attachment only affects events, once you start to look at some of those old secrecy cards at the cost of 1 or even 0, it ends up making them pretty appealing, and the possibility of running effects like Sneak Attack or a Test of Will or any cheap event like that completely for free is a pretty enticing possibility. So I'll be really curious to see what FFG ends up doing with Secrecy, and like we mentioned, I'm very curious to see how it ends up comparing to the Doomed keyword player cards.
The article also spoils a couple other encounter cards. One of them is Curse of the Wild Men, which is a treachery. Its when revealed effect reads, deal 1 damage to each non-unique character in play. If the players control 3 key objectives, Curse of the Wild Men gains Surge. Its shadow effect also reads, attacking enemy gets +1 attack strength for each key objective the players control. So the second clause here in the shadow effect sort of punish you for being further along in the quest, it sounds like, which is interesting. So you're on the first stage or the first trial, this one isn't as bad. If you're in the second or third, the shadow effect or that second clause gets even worse. The first one is very much like Necromancer's Reach from the core set days, except it only targets non-uniques, which is certainly very deadly, or could be very deadly. So that's an interesting treachery.
Really, all I can say about this one is I like seeing scaling effects. It's kind of fun when the encounter deck grows in power just as you do.
Yeah, and the final spoiled encounter card is an enemy, Spirit of the Wild. 28 engagement cost, 1 threat strength, 1 attack strength, 2 defense strength, and 4 hit points. It's both undead and spirit. The Spirit of the Wild cannot have attachments. Spirit of the Wild gets +1 threat strength and +1 attack strength for each key objective the players control. It also has a shadow which reads, attacking enemy gets +1 attack strength for each key objective the players control. So exact same shadow as the treachery. So again, sort of scaling the further along in the trials you are. I will say the art's kind of cool. It sort of reminds me of like a Christmas Carol, one of those ghosts walking around with the keys, but certainly it's very cool. It's nice. Again, one thing I've liked about some of the previous quests is not always having to fight orcs, right, or goblins. Or wargs, heaven forbid, we hate those wargs in our progression series. So we get some undead heroes here. We've got Dunelindings, or however you pronounce it, in the previous quest. So I like seeing different kinds of enemies. Interesting that they can't have attachments, but it makes sense. It's a spirit, it's a ghost. So, a forest snare or a poison stakes really wouldn't do much to a ghost. So it doesn't seem like the beefiest enemy, but certainly, again, as you go along in the trials, he gets bigger and bigger.
So, all in all, I suppose my final thoughts about this adventure pack is I'm excited that it scales, I'm excited for replayability, I'll be really curious to see how it ends up being. I like the fact that through Secrecy, non-leadership decks get their own form of resource acceleration or resource savings, so potentially we can end up seeing some expensive cards put into play for very, very cheap. So, very curious to see what Caleb and Matt do with the Ringmaker cycle.
Yeah, I have to agree. Only one other thing stood out to me in this particular article, and Caleb or the FFG sort of marketing department or communications, whatever you want to call them, have mentioned this in a couple of the Ringmaker Cycle articles, and that is the 3 Trials doesn't focus too heavily on any one player theme. And so again, I think given sort of the community disappointment in the Gondor trait perhaps not being as developed as we were led to believe in some of those announcement articles, again, several articles for this cycle have mentioned it's not focusing on any one player theme. So I read into this perhaps a bit too much, but I would say to all of those of you out there thinking Rohan's going to become this power theme, right? This one player theme. I'm reading these little hints that are being dropped in almost every article for this cycle to say, no, if you're expecting this to be a Rohan focused cycle just because it happens to take place in and around Isengard, I think you'll be sorely disappointed. I think we'll probably get a few Rohan cards in the cycle, the 6 APs, although I'm betting we're not going to get a ton. It mentions Scouts, some Noldor, some Dunedain, obviously some Secrecy stuff, some Sylvan stuff, so I'm not expecting a whole lot of Rohan just because the adventures are in and around Isengard.
I definitely think the Voice of Isengard Deluxe expansion is hopefully going to get Rohan to the point where it's considered fairly well developed. In the last article we saw, the Dunland Trap, they specifically mentioned that the Dwarf, Gondor, Rohan, and Hobbit traits are all developed to the point where, quote, players can build fun and thematic decks around them. So it sounds like they're mostly satisfied with what they've done for those, and it really sounds like they're turning their attention elsewhere.
Yeah, so I'm definitely excited for the second quarter of this year when we can finally play this adventure.
Definitely. So, I suppose that brings this video to a close. Thank you guys for checking out our very first article review. Be sure to let us know what you thought about this video in the comments, if you found it useful, if you found it informative, or just boring, if you'd like to see more videos like this, or if you'd like Matthew and I to avoid doing anything like this ever again at all costs. Be sure to let us know, but as always, thank you guys for watching. Be sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed what you saw, subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already, and we'll see you again soon.